Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to give you a quick introduction into Active Directory. Don't forget about the other resources I have posted on the class shell with those Microsoft Learning links as well as the PowerPoint. So Active Directory is very important typically on a Windows-based network. Active Directory gives us a lot of tools and things that we can do inside of a Windows environment. One of the main things that Active Directory does for us is user authentication. So what I can do inside of Active Directory for user authentication is I can create a centralized user account, and then that user can log into any computer in the domain. So for example, here is a Matt Freilich user that I created. So you can just see my name, and I can see the account login as matt.freilich. And this matt.freilich user could be used to log into any computers that have been joined to the domain. Currently, the only computers I have joined to the domain are my second server, which happens to be Server Core. But typically what you would see is all the other computers within your environment joined to this domain. If you happen to have taken a class out in the CIS or CSA labs, maybe for intro to computers or something else, you would have a domain type of account there. With that account, you can log into any one of the computers within those two labs. And so that user account, again, can be used on multiple machines, and you have the centralized login that looks back to Active Directory for the user account name and their password where it's stored. So if I wanted to create new user accounts, I could just come in here, right click, do a new user, and then I could put in their information. One thing I'll mention here, because this is going to be important for the design lab that you do, is you want to pick a naming convention for whatever it is. If it's groups, users, you name it, you want to pick that naming convention and stick with it. So if I want to I'll create my wife here, Megan Freilich. For my account, I did first name dot last name, so I did matt.freilich. So for her, I want to do megan.freilich as well. You don't want one user account to be first initial and then last name, or just the last name. You want to be consistent because that's going to help in your organization. That's going to help finding things. That's going to help keep things consistent. In here inside of Active Directory, I see my domain. So my domain is a separation of trust. So think of a specific business. So contoso.com, umary.edu, IBM.com, Yahoo.com. They could potentially have an Active Directory environment that houses and stores and organizes all of the different computers, users, groups, and things like that within that particular entity. This class is really focused on a single domain. You could have subdomains like bismarck.contoso.com, fargo.contoso.com, and you separate it out that way. You can also have what's called a larger forest. You can create trusts back and forth. So maybe contoso.com bought a business, which is adatum.com. You typically see that with Microsoft documentation, ADA, TUM, I think, adatum.com. And so those would be separate domains. However, they could trust one another within the forest by setting up trusts. So when you install Active Directory, you get a few Active Directory tools. The tools that you get are Active Directory users and computers. This is where I'm at. You get your domains and trusts, and you get your sites and services. Domains and trusts is where you can see your domains and who you're trusting, subdomains, those sorts of things. Sites and services is for when you have different sites within your Active Directory that would be separated by slower WAN links. We're not going to worry at all about that in this class. Actually, in today's modern environment, you probably don't have to worry about it a whole lot either, just because typically we have good, fast, maybe fiber connections, good, fast VPN connections between sites. So that's really not the scope of this class. The scope of this class is just to kind of introduce us to Active Directory and what it does. So I'm going to go back into the Active Directory users and computers and talk a little bit more about this. One thing I can do inside of Active Directory for organization is create OUs and groups. Now, OUs are called organizational units, and organizational units can be applied group policy, and they can be used to organize in terms of a container within Active Directory. So I'm going to create an OU here, a new organizational unit, and I'm going to call it Bismarck. I'm going to uncheck this so I can delete it later. Otherwise I have to jump through some hoops. So I know it's an OU because of the little symbol. I think it's another like folder on top of a folder here for Bismarck. And so one of the labs you guys are going to do is an AD design lab. So there's some different strategies that you can do to design your OU. One is based on location. One is based on organization. And so here's a couple of examples. So I have corp.com, so we have contoso.com, so you can think in terms of that if it makes it easier for you. And under corp.com, they have locations in San Diego, Seattle, and St. Louis. So they would go and create the OUs for San Diego, Seattle, and St. Louis. And then within the OUs of San Diego, for example, all of the computers that exist in San Diego, all of the users that exist in San Diego, all of the printers that exist in San Diego would be put inside of that OU. In Seattle, all of the users, computers, printers, other Active Directory objects that reside in Seattle would be in that location. So I have just a couple users on my machine, and let's pretend that Matt works in Bismarck. So Matt is now under part of the Bismarck OU. And I have another location. So I'm doing the per location. It's in Minneapolis. And I guess I didn't hit finish for the Megan account, but I will grab administrator and we'll pretend administrator is in Minneapolis. Okay, I can further break these down if I want as well. I can nest OUs within each other. So maybe under Bismarck, I want to have a users. And I'm just going to call it Bismarck users. And then I want to break it down into Bismarck computers as well. Now, why this is important is because of policy. We'll learn about group policy in a future chapter, but your Active Directory design should take that into account. So for example, one of the things you can do through group policy is you can push software. So let's say you wanted to install Google Chrome on all PCs in Bismarck. Well, the way I have this set up right now, it'd be easy to put that policy just right here, and then only Bismarck PCs would get Google Chrome. Nobody else would, because that policy can be applied right there. You cannot apply group policy to just standard groups, which I know sounds wrong and backwards, but you can only apply group policy to OUs, to the domain itself, and then you can also apply it to sites. But again, we're not really focusing on sites at this point. So by location is a very common way to do it. By structure within the organization is another very common way to do it, especially if you only have one location. So here they have corp.com, and then they break it down into an accounting OU, a human resource OU, and a manufacturing OU. So now if you only wanted to install Google Chrome for all accountants, you could place the policy on the accounting OU. What if I wanted it for everybody within corp.com? Well, I could place the policy right at the domain level itself. So that's an option as well. Another option is function. And when I think of function, I kind of think of device level. So they have database servers, email servers, users, maybe it's laptops, maybe it's desktops, maybe it's Dell laptops. You could divide it up like that. Here's a little hybrid structure. They have Denver, and then within Denver they have accounting and human resources. They have Dallas, and within Dallas they have manufacturing and human resources. Okay. So for the lab, which I'll have a separate video for, you guys will be designing your Active Directory structure based on some information that I give you. And so this document, which is out on the shell, can be some help to you in terms of picking a strategy. There really is no right or wrong way. You just want to be able to follow it. It should make sense. And then again, like I said, kind of keep in mind that group policy. Where would you place things? So I have a little bit of a hybrid setup currently going here. I have location, and then within location I have function. Users, computers, maybe I could have servers in here as well. And then I would start to put my user accounts and things in here. Computers, where do computers come from? Well, I have to join computers to the domain to have them show up here. And so just briefly, on my Windows 11 machine, I'm going to show you how you would do that. Process is pretty similar for Windows 10 as well. And there's different ways to do it, but what I typically do is go into the system properties, and then in the system properties you'll typically see domain or work group, or you'll see the device name. I believe it is in Windows 10, and the option to join domain, or the option to like change work group settings. But in either Windows 10 or Windows 11, this is essentially the window you want to look for. What we want to do is we want to give our computers a good computer name. Again, we want to come up with a naming convention and stick to it. So mine is the last name and then the type of computer, so it's Freilich Dell. I don't know if that's the best, but this is just a personal computer, so it's not a big deal. And then what I would do is I would hit change here, and I would change it from a work group to a domain. Now, in order for this to work, the computer that you are adding as part of the domain needs to look to the Active Directory server for DNS. Okay, so let me go back to my Windows server here. This is running Active Directory, and when you install Active Directory, it also runs DNS. And so when we run DNS, we want to look to this machine to resolve the domain. Okay, so what is this machine? What's the IP address? It's 1.1.1.1. So any computers that I want to join to the Contoso.com domain in my little environment would have to have 1.1.1.1 set up for their primary DNS. So if I wanted to make this work on my Dell, and I'm not going to go through the entire process, I would have to go into the IP address settings. I would go into the IP address settings and pretend I'm running on a wired Ethernet connection. I would come into the TCP/IP version 4, and I would use that particular IP address for DNS. Now, if you have everything set up nicely in a network, it would get that automatically through DHCP, but that's not always the case. So if you ever try to join the domain and it says cannot contact the domain, the join was not successful, check your DNS setting. A way you can check the DNS setting through the command prompt, ipconfig/all. Okay, and we'll show you what the DNS server is. This is pointing to itself because it is the DNS server. It's using the loopback. Another thing you could do is you could ping your domain you're trying to communicate with, and you should get a response back. You can also ping the IP of the DNS server as well, and you should get a response back, assuming firewalls are off and whatnot. So Active Directory, back to Active Directory here. We have OUs, which I've created. OUs help us organize. OUs help us push out policy. I can also create groups. I'm just going to come into Bismarck here and create groups. Now, a group is going to be used for security delegation typically. There's some other uses, but we'll just focus on that to make it simple for right now. So I can come in here and do a new group, and maybe I want to call this the sales group. Now, with the sales group, I have some options. I have domain, local, global, universal, and then I have a security or distribution. I'll get into this here in just a little bit, but for right now, I just want to talk about the group type, security. So I'm going to create a sales group, and then what I would do is I would put all my salespeople inside of this group. Okay, so I'd go into the properties of sales, members, and I would start adding my users. Now I don't have a whole lot of users to work with, so we'll pretend Matt's a salesman. We'll pretend the guest is a salesman, and those two people are part of that group now. And then I go and I create another group, and I call it IT. This will be all my IT people. And so inside of the IT group, we'll add the administrator. Oops, if I can spell. And we'll pretend Matt's also in IT. And so what this proves is that a user could be part of multiple groups. The reason why we would do this now is when we go and set permissions on a folder or a file, for example, I don't have to set permissions for each specific user. I can just now add the groups. So I'll just take this perfs logs folder, and I want to set permission on it. So currently administrators and performance log users can view this. Well, maybe I want all sales people. So instead of having to go, Matt and John and Bill and add all those people separately, I can now just give permission to sales, and now who's ever part of sales, I can give them whatever permissions I want. Maybe I want to deny them access or whatever I'm trying to do. So that's why we create groups. Groups are used for permission. They can also be used for distribution groups, like an email. If I want to email all IT people, if I have an Exchange environment that's tied into Active Directory, I can now use these as distribution groups to email all salespeople, email all IT people, and whatnot. Okay, you notice when I created the group, I had some different options here in terms of the scope. I want to explain that here a little bit. And to do that, I'm going to bust out Paint. Oh, actually, I don't want Paint.net. That's too fancy. I just need plain old Paint. All right. This gets a little bit into having multiple domains. So it's, again, a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but I do want to mention it because it is important when you are creating groups. So let's pretend I have 3 domains. And we'll say this first domain here is just domain A, and then I have domain B and domain C. Inside of domain A, I have some users. I have Matt and Kevin. And inside of domain B, I have Tanya and Deb. And inside of domain C, I have Carl and I have Robert. Okay, if I create a domain local group, and I'll just use this oval to represent it. So I'm going to call it DL/sales. It's a domain local group called sales. And I create that domain local group inside of domain A. So I go inside of domain A's Active Directory users and computers. I right click and I do a new group and I call it DL/sales. And in terms of the scope, I choose it to be a domain local. I choose that option. Okay. What this does for me now is this allows me to add users to this group from any one of the domains. So inside of this group, I could add Matt, I could add Kevin, I could add Tanya, I could add Carl. It doesn't matter which domain they exist because I would have trusts back and forth between these domains. I would have to assume that. Again, a little bit beyond scope of this class, but hopefully this makes sense to you in the end. So all of these domains, are tied together because maybe they're all owned by, Microsoft, or maybe they're all owned by UMary, or whatever it happens to be. And they trust one another. So domain local can contain users from any of the domains. However, it can only be used to apply permissions to resources located in this domain. So if there was a folder in domain A, I could come on to that folder in the security tab and I could add the DL sales group. If there was a folder in domain B, I could not use this group. If there was a folder in domain C, I could not use this group either. So that's domain local. Any user from any domain, however, you can only use that group for resources within the domain it was created. And where did I create it? Within domain A. A global, which is the default, is the opposite. A global can only contain users from the group, from the domain in which it was created. So let's come into domain C and let's create a new group. So I come into domain C's Active Directory users and computers and I create a new group and I call that group Marketing Global. When I add users to this global group, I can only add Carl and Robert, and that is it. I cannot add Tanya, Deb, or Matt and Kevin. However, now when I go to apply permissions, I can use this group for permissions on this folder within domain C, or this folder within domain B, or this folder within domain A. So the name local kind of refers to where you can use it for security permissions. Domain local only within the domain in which it was created. Global group, I can use it globally for permissions across, but it can only contain users in which it was created. Lastly, you have a universal group. A universal group is anything. So a universal group can contain any users from any domain, and a universal group can be applied to any resource in any domain. So the question probably is then, well, why don't you just use universal all the time? Well, the problem is universal groups have to constantly be replicated and updated, and in a process when you have multiple domain controllers and multiple domains like this, that can lead to a lot of replication traffic. So typically you don't want to do that by default unless you need to, is Microsoft's advice. So those are your group types. So you'll come in here, you'll create groups, you'll add your users that have that common need or common function to those groups, and then you'll use those groups for security permissions. A couple other quick things I'll show you here in Active Directory. We have the built-in. Built-in will be security groups that will give you automatic access or permissions to certain things. So for example, if I add someone to the account operators group, so if I come into the account operators members and I make Matt an account operator, what he's going to be able to do now is, as the description says, I'll show you the description here, they can administer domain users and groups. So he can create groups, he can add users to the groups, he can rename the groups, he can administer users, so he could reset their passwords, he could add the users to the groups, he could create new groups, do those different things. What if you make someone an administrator? Well, they have unrestricted access to the computer and the domain. What if I make somebody a server operator? They can now go onto the domain servers, they can log into the domain servers because typical users can't, and they could perform server functions like add roles, look at logs, those sorts of things. So built-in groups are there, we can utilize them. Another option that we have is to delegate control over a domain. So let's say my Active Directory environment gets really, really large and I don't necessarily have a ton of IT staff. But I constantly get users from Bismarck that need their passwords reset. And so I have a trusted user in Bismarck, and I want to give him the ability to reset those user accounts just for Bismarck. So what I could do, I'll pretend that trusted user is Matt again. I can delegate control for Matt over this particular OU, and these are the things I can allow him to do. Create, manage, and delete user accounts. Reset passwords, that's what I had mentioned. Read user information, create, delete, manage groups. Do group policy. We haven't talked about that yet, but we will. So now when I hit next and finish, Matt has the ability to reset user passwords inside of Bismarck. If I go into the properties of a user, where is Matt? Matt, I should have drug into the Bismarck users. There he is. If I go into the properties of the user, I just want to mention a couple things. We have our general tab. The general tab requires a first name, last name, and a display name. Everything else is optional. In a really good Active Directory environment, it's good to fill this information out because you can do queries on it, you can run scripts based on it, those sorts of things. Address tab, optional again, but if you can fill it out, I would recommend it. Account tab, this has the user login name. This is where you would unlock a user account if they get locked out because they tried their password too many times. We have some other security options here, like their password never expires. They must change their password at next logon. This one's important. You can expire their account. So let's pretend I know that Matt is going to quit in 3 weeks. I don't want to have to remember to go in on that particular day and expire his password. I can just set kind of a timer here, a date, and it will expire. If I only want Matt to log on to computers between the hours of 8 and 5, for example, I can come in here and I can deny the other hours. And then if he tried to log into the computer on those denied hours, he would not be successful. Log on to, maybe I only want Matt to log on to specific computers. As I mentioned, with a domain user account, you can log into any computer that's part of the domain. But maybe I only want him to log into his Fralick Dell computer. So I can add that to the list, and now he can only log into the Fralick Dell computer, and nothing else he can log into. Profiles, don't worry too much about this at this point. This is where you can create login scripts and change their profile path. Telephones and organization is optional as well. Remote control has to do with remote desktop services. Same with remote desktop services profile. We won't worry about that a whole lot. Dial-in, this has to do with NPS servers and VPN. Environment, this has to do with remote desktop services. Again, don't worry about that at this point. And same with the sessions tab. Really, your main things you'll need to worry about at this point would be your general tab, the account tab, and then this member of tab, which shows all of the groups. By default, everyone's a domain user. And by default, when someone logs into a machine, they're known as an authenticated user. And also by default, everyone is part of the everyone. So everyone is actually known as a special identity, and so is the authenticated user. I don't necessarily see them as a group inside of here, but I know that they're part of that. Okay, I think that should hopefully give you an idea of what Active Directory is at this point. Get you started at least with this chapter and help you out for the lab. Again, I'll have a real quick separate video for the lab kind of explaining that, but you can refer back to this one when you're going through it. Thanks for watching.